Very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the International IoT Security Roundtable Technical Panel 2021. The theme for this year is Nexus of AI and IoT Cyber Analytics. Stay tuned as our live stream will begin at 3 p.m. This session will include Q&A, so do take this opportunity to interact with the speakers live. Submit your questions in the Q&A engagement panel to the right of your screen. A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the International IoT Security Roundtable Technical Panel. My name is Juliana Yao, and I'm delighted to be your MC for today. First and foremost, I'd like to thank everybody for finding time, despite your busy schedule, to attend this roundtable. The International IoT Security Roundtable serves as a platform to galvanize international efforts to address IoT issues, a pressing issue given the rapid proliferation and pervasiveness of IoT devices, which generally lack security provisioning. This year, the technical panel will focus on the nexus of AI and IoT cyber analytics. We will be discussing IoT cyber analytics and the applications of artificial intelligence in the areas of consumer, industrial, and medical IoT, as well as fostering collaborations and partnerships across countries. So we will begin the session with a keynote address, and it brings me great pleasure to introduce Mr. Yigal Una, Director General of the Israel National Cyber Directorate. Director General Una began his career in the field of cyber technology as a captain in the intelligence unit, and he subsequently held a series of senior management positions in the signals intelligence and cyber sectors. He was tasked with setting up and leading the National Cyber Bureau's Cyber Technology Unit in the National Cyber Directorate until his appointment as Director General in 2018. DG Una, please.
Hello, SA, ICW, and the CSA, our colleagues in the CSA, especially my good old friend David Ko. Thank you for having me. Thank you for having Israel in this great event. Still, unfortunately, hybrid, not only physical, but we hope we see it coming. The summer is coming, although speaking about cyber, we're still deep in the winter. And speaking of which, from the Israeli point of view, well, I used to be quoted for long years that the winter is coming following the Game of Thrones. And unfortunately, I think that we can see today that winter is here. I don't know if we are at the peak, at the darkest moment of this cyber winter, but it surely doesn't look good from all aspects of the threat. But we're going to talk about also how we mitigate it and how we're going to overcome it together. But looking at the numbers and the trends of the cyber threat, well, it seems like the COVID-19 pandemic is let's say, not the least of our problems, but a lesser problem than the biggest threat. And we see since the erupt of the COVID-19, but here in Israel, even more since April or May last year, the growing charts, the boost in the number and in the severity of cyber attacks. And you don't need to just look at Israel. If we take a look at the Colonial Pipeline event in the US, of course, the SolarWinds, and also the crippling of the South African seaports for a couple of days or weeks, and in the Ireland, the attack that paralyzed most of its public health in the middle of a pandemic, of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we see in Italy, and we see in the US, attacking the Florida and California watering and water supply systems, and trying to even to poison it. All of it added to one big, very gloomy picture of the threat of what we're facing. And it seems that the imagination of the attackers is just getting more and more vivid and more creative in how to perpetrate and how to find the soft spots. In Israel, I can share with you recent numbers that we got from a big survey that we manage with the Israeli Statistics Bureau, that 1 out of every 5 Israeli businesses, 1 out of the 20%, fell victims to cyber attacks causing data confidentiality, integrity, or availability problems. Half of the Israeli high-tech companies, 47% to be precise, report to fell victims, and 42% of all large businesses. Now, there are only 4%, 1 out of every 30 Israeli businesses that report heavy losses stemming from cyber attacks. We suspect that the problem is with the word report. It's still more reluctant in Israel and probably in other places, in Singapore and other places as well, reluctant to report the losses for many reasons. But we see even 4% is alarming, and we see the growing number of this kind of phenomena. Now, if we take a look at the nature of the cyber weapon, well, this is something that it's not new. It's from the beginning of the cyber age, but it's getting worse, I'm afraid to say. And that is the notion, the understanding that the first time in the human history for hundreds of thousands of years were used for simple weapons to cause minor damage. You know, swords or arrows can kill persons, but on a very small volume. If you want to cause a big damage, a major damage, like a nuclear explosion or something like this, you need very sophisticated weapon. You need chemists, you need physicists, you need engineers, you need the materials, the nuclear materials. And it's rare and very, let's hope, still difficult to get your hands on. And that is not the case regarding cyber weapon. Cyber weapon, well, imagine it's the simplest weapon that you can imagine. It's only letters and numbers written in a computer. That's all, basically, with a lot of versions and of course, a lot of know-how. But it's very easy, very accessible. And it can cause a damage. Well, I managed the nuclear explosion. You can melt down a couple of nuclear power plants and cause 10 times of Hiroshima just using cyber weapons. It's not a secret, it's everyone's concern today. So it dictates a new game rules. And as we go, and this conference is about IoT and Industry 4.0 and all of that, well, we see it coming. It's all connected, and it's a good thing that it's all getting connected and more automated vehicles, ships, maybe even airplanes in the future. It gets our life more easy, more comfortable, and even more safer. But it gets on the dark side. It allows even the small groups, terror groups or cybercrime groups, it allows them to perpetrate and to cause damage or to get to higher or darker places than they could ever imagine in any other point in human history. And this is something that still governments, I must say, not the Israeli government and not the Singapore government, but still many governments still don't do enough. And that's the case also with the Israeli government, I must say. We are not doing fast enough and strong enough in order to get ready to adopt or to fully digest this notion that the all rules of the game are changed. Now, a single individual hacker can get his hands on the most sophisticated, most dangerous weapons too easy by, 1 day or even finding 0 days. But it's more difficult for individuals. But for terror group or rogue countries, well, many times they don't need even to put too much effort because they are attacked with these kinds of weapons by the good guys. And then they just need to get it. It doesn't explode like, kinetic weapons. And they get it and reuse it, reverse engineer it and reuse it against the good guys. Or it leaks. And unfortunately, too many leaks from the good guys all around the world and too many teams that find exploits on a daily, hourly basis and publish it on the darknet or other places irresponsibly, and it falls to the hands of the bad guys that using that. So we are living, in fact, in a much more dangerous world, and we see that with the numbers. Just take a look at the ransomware pandemic that we all suffer. I don't think there's anyone around the globe that is connected to some computerized machine or processor that is not haven't experienced a ransomware attack, and we see the numbers. The numbers are, the average ransom paid in attacks in the US in the past year are now above $180,000 per case, $180,000 per case, and we face tens or hundreds of thousands of cases. Now imagine the impact on economy. Someone pays that, well, it needs to get it back from the customers, from the innocent people, the public, and it's getting a big burden on the economies. Now, we are, of course, disturbed by the economic impact, but we also have a look at the downtime. The average downtime of ransomware attacks in the US, we don't have an actual numbers in Israel that I can share with you at this moment, but I believe it's not too different. It's 16 days downtime in the Q4 2020. 16 days average downtime because of ransomware attacks. And that is disturbing when you are thinking and dealing with financial systems and with other systems. So, talking about these threats, don't forget the influence campaigns. And we see more and more, and we, democratic, open liberal societies are more vulnerable for this kind of attacks. But not only this side of the equation. We saw an amazing attack, influence cyber attack in Iran just a couple of weeks ago against the Evin, the notorious Evin prison. An opposition, Iranian opposition, claimed to have to stand behind this attack, but they hacked into the computers and the cameras in this notorious prison and show the world, publish to the world the atrocities that the regime there is doing to the prisoners, political prisoners and others. They didn't do that for ransom. They didn't do that for espionage. They done it to show to the world the atrocities, but the impact, the capability, the understanding, the creativity of this kind of attack that aims to, in Iran, the soft belly of Iran, how the regime deals with the citizen. They try to hide it, but we are in a world that secrets and hiding places are getting more and more public because of cyber, and we need to take care of that. Also, because if we want, and we do want to take care of privacy issues, well, it's all connected. All our details, all our stuff is around there. As a government, and now we're getting to the what we're doing here. As government and as governments in plural, working together, we need to get to a higher level of cooperation, collaboration, and working more hardly to share information responsibly and accurately between governments, between like-minded governments, to make sure that we stand together in a much better way than we used to face this global pandemic. Because when we take a look at the perpetrators, the threat actors, well, they're smart. They usually don't do the attacks in their homeland. They attack abroad. And the global legal system and the global law enforcement system are still, well, a little behind, to say the least, in order to mitigate that and to deal with this phenomena. It gives a much more responsibility to us, to the government cyber agencies, like the CSA, like the INCD, and many others that are participating in this great event, to get more, to put the sleeves on and to get our hands into more actual, more tangible measures that we can first share information, and second, share tools and actions against perpetrators, and to close exploits, to find exploits and close them as soon as possible globally, not just every country by itself, and to hunt down all the measures, all the hiding places of those who are trying to attack and cause damage to our countries, societies, and it's just getting, the need is getting stronger as we go more digital and more modern. In that spirit, well, again, thank you. We have a great relations with Singapore. We're about to sign an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, as another symbol of the great relations, operational relations that we have between our agencies and our countries. And we look forward finally to come over physically and to meet with our good friends and colleagues in Singapore. Thank you very much.
Thank you, DG Una, for the thought-provoking address. We will now proceed on to the panel discussion. And in this session, our panel speakers will first give a short presentation before moving on to the discussion. As this session includes Q&A, do take this opportunity to interact with our speakers by submitting your questions in the Q&A engagement panel to the right of your screen. It is also my pleasure to welcome our moderator for the panel discussion, Mr. Teo Xiangzheng of Ensign Info Security. Xiangzheng is the head of advisory at Ensign Info Security, one of Asia's largest pure-play cybersecurity firms. He is responsible for leading advisory services, providing expert counsel and advisory to leaders on cybersecurity strategy, enabling them to make informed risk management decisions and improve their cyber readiness and resilience across operational and technological domains. Mr. Teo. And now also to welcome our first panel speaker, Mr. Atsushi Umino, Director, Office of the Director General for Cybersecurity at the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications in Japan. Since joining the Ministry of Post and Telecommunications, Mr. Umino has mainly been involved in policy making and research activities in the field of information and communication technologies. Let us welcome Mr. Umino, please.
My name is Atsushi Umino, and I'm in charge of international cybersecurity affairs within the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications of Japan, which is called MIC. It's my great pleasure to join this roundtable today, and I'll talk about MIC measures for cybersecurity and our R&D activities relative to cybersecurity and AI. And firstly, I would like to share some current issues on cyber threats. The National Institute of Information and Communications Technology, which is called NICT for short, has a system for observing cyber attacks. A system called NICTA monitors the darknet, which consists of more than 300,000 unused IP addresses. By monitoring unused IP addresses, we can find a lot of traffic toward unused IP addresses, including port scanning activities for malware. And this slide shows the increase of suspicious packets, which NICTA observed last year. There has been a significant increase since 2019, and the attack targets have varied. IoT is still the largest target, and attacks against remote desktop protocol has increased. And next, let me briefly explain IoT security measures in Japan from this slide. In Japan, all terminal equipment which connects directly to the network of telecommunications operators is required to meet the technical standards for terminal equipment as set under the Telecommunications Business Act. Devices which meet the requirements of this standard receive a conformity mark, which is called the T mark. As this slide shows, terminal equipment which is directly connected to telecommunications networks must mainly have these functions. The first is access control via a remote control function. The second is features to encourage users to change their default password settings. The third is firmware update features. These are minimum requirements to keep our networks secure, so these requirements are mandatory. As the IoT Acceleration Consortium, we published the IoT Security Guideline in 2016. This guideline is related to the design and manufacture of IoT equipment and network connectivity. And the guideline is currently in the process of being incorporated into the global standards like ISO, IEC, or ITU-T. And from this slide, I'll talk a little about more technical measures to ensure IoT security. We have mainly two measures for security of IoT devices: active observation by the Notice project and passive observation by the NICTA project. And the first one is the Notice project. This is an overview of the project. First, NICT scans IoT devices in Japan, which have global IP addresses, and then it tries to log into these devices using weak ID and password settings. If NICT finds vulnerable IoT devices, then it provides information about them, including their IP addresses and timestamps to the ISPs. And the ISPs then identify the users of these devices and contact them to request they change their password. We have a notice support center to help users address vulnerabilities in IoT devices. In addition, the current project, we plan to make the alerts to users more effective. This year, ISPs will also start to alert their users by postal mail with official leaflets. And besides the Notice project, we also have the NICTR Alert project. As I explained in the first slide, NICTR is an observing system for the darknet, and it can detect suspicious packets. When NICT identifies a device which is sending packets to the darknet, information, including the IP addresses and timestamps of the device, are sent to the ISPs, and the ISPs then identify the users and send an alert to them. And regarding NICTR, NICT also provides monitoring and alerting system based on NICTR. We call it Daedalus, and Daedalus detects attacks from inside by monitoring darknet of cooperative organization. And this slide shows the project's progress in the last August. On the left, you can see the results of the Notice project. The number of IoT devices which had weak password settings and which could be logged into was around 1,790 last August. They were subject to user alerts. On the right, you can see the results of the identification of malware infected devices observed by the NICTR. The number of the devices which seem to be infected with malware and subject to user alerts were around 107 per day last August. And next, based on various information collected through the project, NICT conducts research and development using AI techniques that analyze and understand the security situation and automate security operations within an organization. Today, I will introduce some technologies from NICT's R&D, such as priority determination, identification of malware functions, attack detection, and protection. And first, I'll talk about technology for making judgments on the priority of incidents, especially the screening of alerts by machine learning. To protect network, we might introduce a lot of security appliances and get multiple alerts from them. Thus, NICT developed a screening technology that uses machine learning. They successfully reduced alerts by 87% by screening our insignificant security alerts and recommend candidates of emerging threats on the rise. This screening technology will reduce the workload of security operator. And the second technology I will explain is one of the automation of malware analysis, which in other words is the auto classification of IoT malware. At first, NICT extracts the features of IoT malware and makes the AI learn these features. Then the AI is able to classify IoT malware with an accuracy of 90% or more. This auto-classification technology helps to make countermeasures against malware more effective. The third technology is for the detection of attacks and threat prediction. NICT succeeded in the early detection of synchronization of IoT malware a few days before a large-scale infection. It is enabled by machine learning to detect the synchronization of infection activities. This technology protects network engineers from having to deal with the chaos of large-scale infections of malware. This marks the end of my presentation. And MIC is contributing to IoT security, and we would like to do more to do both more and better with international cooperation and collaboration in the future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Umino. Next, let us welcome our second panel speaker, Mr. Leo Simonovic, Vice President and Global Head of Industrial Cybersecurity at Siemens Energy. Mr. Simonovic is responsible for setting the strategic direction for Siemens Energy's industrial cybersecurity business worldwide. He identifies emerging market trends, works with customers and Siemens businesses to provide best-in-class cyber offerings, and contributes to the company's thought leadership on the topic. Mr. Simonovic, please.
This is my first conference, and it's great to be with you, albeit virtually. The future of energy is at an inflection point. While the pace and scale of innovation enabled by digitalization in the energy sector is breathtaking, it has an Achilles heel, cybersecurity. Without a new architecture to protect the energy transition, cyber attacks could append the promise of a more efficient, sustainable, and clean energy future. With 2.5 billion new industrial devices expected to be connected to energy infrastructure in the next 2 years, from gas turbines and microgrids to electric vehicle charging station, digitalization is rapidly transforming the energy industry. From a century-old commodity-based business run on analog equipment into a technology-driven industry that makes risk-based decisions and moves with internet-like speeds. Digitally connected energy assets controlled by operational technology and networked with information technology are enabling energy companies to automate systems and control assets remotely. This brings dramatic operational efficiencies. We see big data improving performance, and we see a growing interconnected ecosystem of renewable and low or zero carbon technologies. Yet, as energy companies' business models require digitalization to power industrial equipment, they also become increasingly vulnerable to cyber attacks. So resilience and cybersecurity against cyber threats are critical to ensuring trust and providing stability of operations against unplanned outages or worse, safety events. Whether an organization acknowledges it or not, cybersecurity is the keystone of the modern business model. Smart leaders will take the challenge head on and make cybersecurity a competitive advantage in the digital ecosystem. Now, this is easier said than done. Energy companies face significant technical challenges to monitor, detect, and stop cyber attacks. The scale is massive. Physical energy assets, their control systems, and their IT networks generate billions of data points from connections and commands every day. But it's not just the scale, it's also the complexity of deploying and scaling cybersecurity solutions across a vast and complex industry that was never designed to account for cybersecurity at the device level, let alone as a system of systems level. An innovation-based architecture to secure the energy transition can overcome the technological and economic hurdles we're facing today. But before I tell you about this new model, we need to dive deeper into the tensions between the promise of a digital energy ecosystem and its vulnerabilities to cyber attacks. Nothing represents the benefits of the energy transition and its Achilles heel more so than the two events of 2020 that you all know, and neither is related to COVID. In 2020, BP unexpectedly announced that they would ramp down oil and gas production over the next 10 years and transform into a digital energy company operating across industrial sectors. BP's step is a bold one for a major oil and gas company, but they're not alone. Across the industry, companies are reacting to market pressures, new technologies that are driving competition, and of course, the demand to reduce emissions and move to a zero carbon economy. This is all possible because of digitalization. On the other hand, just as we thought, 2020 couldn't get any worse. In the closing weeks of last year, we witnessed the SolarWinds cyber attacks. While not an attack on physical energy equipment per se, the attack is the latest glaring example of malicious actors deliberately targeting public and private sector energy and critical infrastructure with sophisticated cyber attacks. Increasingly, mega attacks like SolarWinds use critical infrastructure assets often developed and owned by the private sector as collateral in broader geopolitical conflict between nations. Cutting off power, water, or pipeline flows to an entire city to paralyze regional economies or aggravate citizens is an attractive prospect for a malicious foreign actor that wants to inflict chaos on a rival nation. We saw that most recently with Colonial Pipeline right here in the United States, where energy was shut down for over a week, impacting gasoline consumption up and down the East Coast of the United States. And so, protecting citizens from geopolitically motivated disruptions is now a responsibility not just of governments, but for any organization operating critical infrastructure. SolarWinds and Colonial have renewed calls for ambitious actions to secure the energy transition from cyber attacks. But what remains unclear is how to reimagine security in the digital age. Securing the energy transition is about reliability. The industry needs to apply the same attention focused on ensuring reliable and affordable delivery of energy to a new task: protecting a complex network of OT assets vulnerable to cyber attacks. I'm going to talk first about the small picture question of how an individual company secures their assets affordably, and then zoom back out to consider the industry-wide security challenge, because we have to be able to secure and solve both challenges simultaneously. It won't come as a surprise to you, but to secure the energy transition, you first and foremost need to stop cyber attacks. Until recently, most oil and gas companies lacked the visibility and context to protect the energy's digital assets. At a fundamental level, they couldn't defend what they could not see. But this is changing. New AI-based solutions can give companies the context and visibility needed to both stop attacks before they execute and also optimize operations managed by big data and cloud computing. At Siemens Energy, we've come up with a methodology and technology powered by artificial intelligence called EOS.ai that helps unify IT and OT data into a single thread stream. We've done the hard work to create a common language between digital and physical assets. Today, most chief information security officers and security operations centers lack equal technologies and strategic capabilities to defend OT systems as well as IT systems. For energy and critical infrastructure companies running on industrial IoT platforms, especially small and medium-sized companies, many CISOs and SOC analysts with strong IT security capabilities are overwhelmed or simply lack the capacity to monitor, detect, and prevent cyber attacks on physical assets, and then analyzing both IT and OT threats together. These companies increasingly need to be able to defend physical and digital assets running on industrial IoT platforms. So they require new solutions purpose-built for the hyper-connected world. With EOS, defenders responsible for securing industrial IoT are able to apply equal monitoring and detection capabilities to both physical and digital assets in a single security operations center. If we think about this is a powerful shift. Instead of reacting to attacks already underway, defenders can disrupt attacks in early stages. Companies can implement precision defenses when confronted with breaches. Instead of an all or nothing shutdowns, as we saw again with Colonial, with precision defense, companies can now undertake the hard work of getting ahead of attackers and purge only the affected system without impacting the rest of the operations. No more and no less. AI tools that automate monitoring and detection, that leverage human analysts, offer major benefits to the industry. Machine learning algorithms to differentiate between normal operations and warning signs are an important indicator and a form of intelligence for us to act. Smarter alerts and automation free up human analysts to investigate anomalies and access the likely intent of attacker before the attacks execute. Solving these technical hurdles through AI are really exciting developments, especially for us at Siemens Energy. And making them affordable is key. So, as we think about what's next, while some large energy companies have the balance sheets to undertake the adoption of novel technologies and innovate cybersecurity programs, most lack the funding and expertise to secure their operations affordably. The result is a big gap between security capabilities of a large operator and the small and medium-sized companies that share the same infrastructure and supply chain. Attackers who want to target big companies don't need to go head on. They can start small and then cascade out, causing industry-wide disruption. And this is why we must help small and medium companies secure themselves. As we look forward, we need to shorten the technology adoption cycle, especially for those small and medium enterprises. Industry must create innovative public-private partnerships to scale market-ready technologies through public-backed loans or grant programs to stay ahead of attackers. Providing new cyber solutions with early adopters in the energy sector also builds the foundation for other agencies and regulatory bodies, as well as more budget-conscious energy companies to trust the efficacy of AI-based monitoring and detection solutions for the IoT environment. So, to protect the energy transition over the long term, the ecosystem requires transparency to reveal the true cost of security, adopt the innovation cycle, and establish market-based architectures to invest in programs for the future. Time is right for energy companies to step out of their comfort zones and into the future. The energy companies and their push towards the energy transition hinges on cybersecurity to defend with affordable, efficient, and clean energy system as it powers homes and businesses across the world. Cybersecurity measures must no longer be an afterthought. Securing the new energy landscape will be the most important challenge facing energy companies in the coming years. But there are reasons to be confident. Historically, the energy sector does a good job of reinventing itself. New technology and business models arise all the time. Today is no different. And so I thank the organizers and for giving me the platform to talk about this important issue, and look forward to more discussions in the regions on the topic of the energy transition and the importance of cybersecurity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Simonovic. Now let's move on and welcome our third panel speaker, Mr. Huang Qiang, Head of Product Management, IoT Security Solution at Palo Alto Networks. He has over 20 years of deep experience in a wide range of technologies, including network security, enterprise networking, and IoT. In recent years, Mr. Huang incubated several industry-first IoT products and solutions and developed partnerships across industries such as manufacturing, smart buildings, and smart cities. Mr. Huang, please.
Hi, hello. It's great to be part of this event. My name is Qiang Huang, part of Palo Alto Networks, a leading cybersecurity vendor. So today I'd like to share some of the insight we got in terms of how do you leverage machine learning to gain visibility and secure your medical devices in the healthcare environment. So we have been at it for about the last 5-6 years, and Palo Alto also pioneered using machine learning in terms of IoT. So we'd like to share some insight here and also want to learn from you as well to get your feedback. So first, I want to share a bit of what we see in the industry. If you look at the healthcare delivery organization across the globe, increasingly we're seeing digitization trend. As a result, we're seeing more medical devices are network connected. And with the COVID impact, with the telehealth, this number continue to rise. So we're expecting about doubling the number of devices in the next couple of years based on the Gartner forecast. On the other side, we see a lot of security concerns coming from this healthcare sector. Here at the Palo Alto, we have a dedicated threat research team, Unit 42. We have done some research in this space. As you can see from the chart, healthcare sector remains to be the #1 target when it comes to cybersecurity attacks. A lot of challenges from the customers in terms of how they secure these medical devices, right? The #1 challenge has been lack of visibility because these devices owned by a different team from IT. So a lot of times people don't have the right visibility as a way to secure that. We see a lot of dedicated threats against these medical devices that has a patient information, mission critical. We see ransomware, and we have seen ransom average about $300K US, as high as $10 million in some cases, right? It's also very hard to secure these devices, all right? They're quite fragmented, and you can't really put an agent on it as your laptop. So often network is playing a bigger role when it comes to securing these medical devices. So here's a bit of more details in terms of what we see in real customer network based on a lot of research. If you look at your hospital, it's a mix of IT and medical network together that make it even more complicated to secure. Based on our research, looking at the millions of devices on our platform, so here's a bit of interesting stats in terms of what are the medical devices we see. As you can see, 50% of them on the medical side are imaging system. And then guess what? 80% of these systems are running outdated Windows operating systems. So quite vulnerable. And about 60% of these medical devices has a medium to high security risk that you need to pay attention. So we see a lot of customers starting to use some of the existing security solutions, such as network segmentation, as a way to separate IT and medical devices to prevent threat and lateral movement. But because of a lack of visibility, as you can see, over 70% of these so-called healthcare VLANs has a mix of IT, IoT, medical devices that make it not very effective in terms of security, in terms of segmentation. So how do you secure these medical devices in this challenging environment? So here's a vendor agnostic framework we recommend to our customers. So really nicely bring together your security lifecycle and your medical asset lifecycle together, so you can look at it at every single step. It all starts from gaining complete visibility of your assets in the hospital environment, from IT, IoT to medical devices. It's very important to have that complete visibility. And then based on that, you can start to gather a lot of the context for this device, the risk context, to do a risk assessment. And then based on that risk assessment, you can start to create your zero trust policy and then enforce that, and then make sure you continue to monitor the device behavior to detect unknown threat, to fine tune your policies. So this really also aligns with the NIST zero trust framework. So that's a good framework for you to have as a reference. So now it all starts from having the right visibility of your assets of your medical device. So, but it has been very challenging for many customers. Their existing IT solutions and security solutions are listed somewhere down below the slide. They don't support IoT today. As a result, they have a lot of a blind spot. So here's an interesting chart we're seeing on the real customer network. If you look at the existing solutions such as NAC and CMDB, you see a whole bunch of PCs and servers, but really they're medical devices, they're Windows system running medical apps. So if you don't have the right visibility, your security won't be effective. So we're of the view that machine learning can be a great technology for you to build such an inventory of your medical device. Why is that? Because these medical devices, these IoT devices, they're really machines designed for specific OT applications. So their behavior should be quite predictable. So you can use machine learning for two purposes. One is to build a device classification to understand what device you have. The second is really to monitor the behavior of the device and baseline that, and use that baseline to create the policies. So we recommend a 3-tier model. Tier 1 is to understand what kind of device you have. Is this a camera? Is this an infusion pump? Is this medical imaging system? So machine learning can be a great way to start, and even for some of the never seen device. much better than the signature-based approach, which is very hard to scale. Then it's about understand the make and model of the device. Based on that, you can get a lot of vulnerability information. You can get a lot of the other information for you to take action. And the third one is about individual device you want to monitor. So you should also look at the device behavior and then contrast with the baseline I described. Because for ultrasound machines, it's supposed to do 3-4 things. Once you use machine learning as a way to build a baseline, you can understand how your machine behaves differently from all the other similar machines across the globe. You can use that baseline information as a way to create a policy, as a way to detect anomalies. This is very useful. So let me bring together in terms of how you can use that information to create policies. It's very important, not just have a visibility, but also the policy enforcement. So here you see an example that we got the ultrasound machine. We translate that device classification from machine learning into a concept called device ID, so that you can apply the policies based on the device insight, based on the device context, not based on the IP and the MAC address, which is never scalable. And the second that you can see there's a contrast of the baseline of this ultrasound machine. It tells you how your ultrasound machine behaves differently from the device baseline. You can use that as a foundation to create a zero trust policy in terms of where this device can go. So this policy can also translate it into a firewall policy as well. So when it comes to enforcement, as you can see on the firewall side, you can apply a policy based on the device classification, based on the machine learning based baseline, and then you can really nicely apply a policy to secure the device and prevent lateral movement. So this really helps you to automate your zero trust workflow and make it very effective. So in a nutshell, we covered a few things, right? The medical devices are on the rise, and it's very hard to secure these devices. They're subject to a lot of cybersecurity risk. And we recommend you to start from the visibility, build the inventory of your asset. And the machine learning is a great technology for you to discover these devices and classify them. And also use machine learning as a way to build a behavior baseline and understand the behavior compliance of your medical devices. And then based on the machine learning insight in terms of the device classification, in terms of the baseline, you can then create a zero trust policy to enforce that using your firewall, using your network, and then continue to monitor the behavior of the device to fine tune your policy and detect any unknown threats. So that's kind of our recommendation, how you can leverage machine learning to secure your medical device. So hopefully this is helpful and give you some insight in terms of how you leverage the new technology to secure your IoT and IoMT devices. Thank you. If you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Thank you, Mr. Huang. And last but not least, let us welcome our fourth panel speaker, Mr. John Moore, Managing Director of the IoT Security Foundation. He has more than 30 years of experience in electronic systems and microelectronic industries and holds executive leadership and general manager responsibilities for IoT-SF. John previously served as Vice President at the UK's National Microelectronics Institute, where he was tasked with establishing the UK Electronic Skills Foundation, running the Future World Symposium, and participating in overseas trade missions. Mr. Moore, please.
Hello, my name is John Moore and I'm the Managing Director of the IoT Security Foundation. I've been given a few minutes here to talk to you about how the world can come together to help secure the IoT. So the first thing to say is that the IoT has been described as an independent, interdependent, complex system of systems with no guiding mind. Now that's great for innovation, but it's also horrific for cybersecurity. Of course, it's also great for the many adversaries of all different denominations that are seeking to exploit the IoT too. So it's multidimensional, it's an intractable problem, and it transcends national borders as well. So we believe that our best defense is, of course, collaboration. And we need not only defense in depth, but we need breadth too. We need it at the international level, and local collaborations at all levels, depending, irrespective of what stakeholder group you're part of, whether you're part of a standards organization, an industry association like IoTSF, whether you're a national government, and especially if you're in academic or in research institutions. So in order to achieve that collaboration, we kind of need to create this multidisciplinary super blue team that can look at the many problem areas, not just the technical, but also the economic, the policy, the cultural, the political, the ethical, and philosophical, just to name but a few. And in doing so, our collective goal is to simply not lose. We need to manage the problem to an acceptable level. So again, our collective aim is to build in systemic resilience. So the nature of our collective challenge looks a bit like this. Before I talk about the enemies of cybersecurity, I just want to say a few words about what we need to be thinking about and how we make that step forward. We have to recognize that with those many stakeholders and with the many problems that we're trying to address, that each of those individual actors will be at different stages of their journey and their maturity. So we need to be progressive, we need to be adaptive, and we should definitely not expect perfection, certainly on the first go, but we need to really work towards that goal of progressive. I've put a few words here about some of the areas that I think we ought to be looking at to really help solve or address these issues. The first areas I'd like to talk about is capability and capacity. We need to improve these. We need to make sure that where we share appropriate knowledge, we do it effectively, whether this is in helping designers design security in, or even looking at threats and the threat landscape, and also sharing threat knowledge. We also need to be very mindful about the cost of implementing security. My organization believes that security is an investment, but the world at large generally tends to see security as a cost. So we need to do all we can to minimize those cost barriers. And finally, we need to be thinking about complexity. Cybersecurity, and in our case, IoT cybersecurity, is incredibly complex and it's very nuanced. So what we need to do is we need to simplify where we can so that we speed the ease and adoption of those solutions and those collective efforts. I'd like to narrow the talk now to really talk about this, the focus and the journey status of where we are in terms of standards and regulations, and also bring in the active role of best practice. I'd also like to mention that the very nature of this problem, its many dimensions and its international nature, means that we are going to get a diversity of solutions and responses. And we think that's good. Having that diversity in the system is a great thing for security. But we also are very mindful that we need to make sure that we are convergent on the outcomes that we're looking for. So diversity in solution is good. Convergent on outcomes is also good too. I'd also very much like to talk about how we're looking to proliferate best practice and give you two example areas where IoTSF is applying itself. Now then, this is a status slide, and I very much hope that our audience recognizes all of these standards. The first one to mention is the ETSI 303-645. If you're in Europe and beyond, that is very much the leading baseline cybersecurity standard in IoT consumer, which we consider to be a baseline case. But also if you're operating in North America, then you'll be more interested in the work that's going on at NIST, especially their 8259 standards, both parts A and B. An emerging standard coming through shortly is the ISO 27402 standard. But that shouldn't be news to most of this audience. But the point I wanted to raise here when I talk about lowering the barriers, the ETSI standard is free. The NIST standard is free. The ISO standard, unfortunately, is likely to come with a paywall, and that's not good for the world's security. So I'd just like to take the opportunity here to say that there's anybody listening has any influence with ISO to get them to consider making some of those baseline cybersecurity standards free. I completely understand the way the model works. However, baseline cybersecurity standards, we believe, should be free. I'd like to thank one of our members for doing some research into the status of regulation. It's something that we are very keen to keep an eye on, but there are developments happening all the time. So a big thank you to Cedric at Setone for this. If we look at what's going on in regulation and has been going on in the 3 short years since the ETSI standard has come to life, what we can say is that there are 18 known global regional regulations, 17 of which can be satisfied by the ETSI standard. The one that is not satisfied is simply we do not have enough detail about that standard yet. So what we can say is that in terms of meeting global regulations, it looks like the ETSI standard is a leading standard to apply. I also wanted to talk about the role of best practice, the role that my organisation plays. Back in 2015, we looked at creating best practice guide for consumer companies. This turned into a compliance framework as we realised that it could be applied not just in consumer, but across other areas too. So, for example, enterprise and industrial applications. And the role of that framework is as important today as it was back when we started. It fits in with the standards development and it fits in with the regulatory progress that we make as well. I'm delighted to tell you that since we published that, there's been over 7,000 downloads. We'll be updating it to release 3 soon, which will include mapping to the ETSI standard and the NIST standard. And just to spell out why we think it's so important. Number one, it really helps companies who are less mature in their security posture to help them understand what's necessary to improve that. And what we like to think of is this security ramp. So if they start from nowhere, they can move up the maturity ramp. So they start from nowhere, they get to a point where they can assess their own security capability, where they hopefully will be confident enough to make some external declarations. This then follows into third-party attestation and maybe certification processes, because what we know talking to our members and the labs that do the certification is that they regularly get asked to do certifications from companies that are nowhere near prepared. So the role of best practice is really helping companies on that first step and getting them to the point where they can satisfy some of the more advanced regulatory aspects. So the second area that I wanted to focus on very briefly is at IoTSF, we're looking at what we do. We've been asking ourselves, how do we scale this effort up? We need to scale it up to meet the threat that we see from adversaries. So how can we remove our own capacity barriers? How can we move faster and have more impact? That is to say, can we not only think globally, but act locally? We think we have an answer to that. Delighted to tell an international audience for the first time something that we told our members or announced to our members back in June 2021. We invited our members to consider creating local chapters, and we provided a framework to do this. Again, it's in line with those areas that I outlined earlier, the challenges that we have. We have a principle of simplicity. So how do we enable our members with minimal effort and bureaucracy to really help proliferate security awareness, best practice, and also proliferate education and networking? It's not quite ready to make some formal announcements, but I can tell you we've got some exciting announcements in the pipeline. And I hope that by the time we get to our annual conference at the beginning of November, that we're ready to make that and announce our first chapter. So that's it. But my time is up. Just like to recount what I think I've told you and hopefully what you heard. Number one, we need to collaborate at every level. Our best form of defense is in both depth and breadth. We need to be thinking about progressive efforts, and we must not let perfection become the enemy of the good. So we need to increase our capability and our capacity. Meanwhile, we need to reduce our costs and simplify. And finally, IoTSF is an organisation which is collaborative by design, and for 2021 and 2022, we're going global, and we hope that some of you will come along with us on that journey. So that's my time up. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. And with that, we will now commence with the panel discussion. So over to you, Mr. Teo.
Thank you, Juliana. So we've now come to the technical panel discussion for this part of the session, which is Nexus of AI and IoT Cyber Analytics. I'd like to update everyone that unfortunately Mr. Leo Simonovic was unable to join us at this time. And now we have Max Martino. Max, maybe for you to give us a brief introduction of yourself, please.
Absolutely, yes, and appreciate the time and opportunity to speak on Leo's behalf. So my name is Max Martino, and that was pronounced very accurately. I'm responsible for the cyber business for Siemens Energy across entire Asia, and actually have been in Singapore. I'm based in Singapore as well, and hope to enlighten the audience with some of our approaches and methodologies, how we actually look at the IoT divergence in the energy sector. Also, I'm virtually looking at a lot of familiar faces. It's not something I can see, but I looked at some of the audience, and welcome to see you here.
Thanks, Max. So for the first segment, we are discussing the topics of IoT risks, concerns, and opportunities. To kick it off, let's have the first question to Atsushi. What are some of the current challenges in Japan's IoT cybersecurity? Can you share what strategies Japan is looking to address these new challenges?
The greatest challenge in our IoT security would be the fact that the cyber attacks toward IoT devices are increasing and count for the top among various attacks. And this is highly relevant with the features of IoT devices in that they are connected to network and affect overall systems and services once they get cyber attacks. And at the same time, their life cycle is relatively long, and security measures taken in the phase of the deployment might not always be effective as time goes by. And in addition, it's not easy to effectively monitor IoT devices, and functions that each device has might be limited. And in view of these elements, our government is implementing Notice and NICTR alert project that I introduced in my presentation. And these projects are led by the government that intends to identify vulnerable IoT devices and raise awareness to their users by providing alerts. And this is because the technologies adopted in the NICTR observation system is a cutting-edge one, and it's not easy for a single private company to introduce them. And along with these activities, we have established some new rules to require users of IoT devices that connect the internet to have minimum functions such as access control system and encouraging changes of initial passwords. And this is based on the concept of security by design. And we also created an IoT security guideline a few years ago, as I mentioned in my presentation, in order to encourage users and developers of IoT devices to have and recognize some security features. And we are trying to standardize the main concept of this guideline in international fora. And we believe that it is also important to share various information on IoT security risks and promote information sharing activities through our private collective entities called ICT ISAC. And that's our main strategies and experiences. Thank you.
Thanks. And John, maybe to you, from the IoTSF, clearly there's more interest towards bringing larger communities together. What can we do more moving forward to galvanize global efforts to build a safer and more secure IoT ecosystem? Could you share some of the new IoT cybersecurity initiatives that IoTSF is working on to encourage cooperation in IoT cybersecurity analytics?
Sure. So I think hopefully those of you listening to my talk will see that central to IoTSF's mission is the proliferation of best practice. And this largely takes the form of process and people out of that process, people and technology equation. However, technologies play an important role, of course. But what we usually do is we usually leave this to market forces to decide. So we talk about the how to do something and the what is necessary, but we generally leave the specific implementation choices to our audience. However, there is a very important role that IoTSF can and has begun to play in a more technical space. As a non-profit organization, as a non-profit organization, we apply the very same thinking and ask ourselves, how can we help secure IoT through collaborative efforts? In this case, can we work with our members, our partners, and the wider ecosystem to help automate security hygiene? And importantly, can we do that at scale? And if we can, how do we do that? And what role do we play, given that A, we don't manufacture anything, and we certainly do not sell operational security services? So it's exciting to tell you that we are actually doing that right now through a collaborative initiative, which we call Many Secured. Indeed, for those interested, you can look it up. There's a website called manysecured.net. And there's a couple of key points I'd like to raise just to help you understand what Many Secured is about. The first thing is that we recognize the importance of the router or the gateway as a critical node that we can provision security within. So we can protect a local network and we can support legacy devices, but we can also look at new ways to collaborate using the power of AI and the device crowd. It's also worth mentioning at this point that the network, the router or the gateway is also a central point, which is the target of attack. So anything that we put there has to be as secure as possible in its own right. So as a central node, it's an ideal place to look at using IoT analytics, especially the smart flavor, which can automatically detect threats and trigger mitigations when they occur. And of course, in order to do that, we need a couple of things, and I'll mention those. In fact, I think Chung mentioned some of this in his talk. So first and foremost, we need lots of input data so that we can benchmark our systems. Secondly, we need lots of training data so that we can learn what good and bad look like. And so the whole spirit behind Many Secured is essentially looking to create open technical standards and schemas for making security interoperable and collaborative. So it's a funded project. It's open to all interested stakeholders. We're fortunate enough to have some core partners, which we think are great, and those include Cisco, the University of Oxford, a specialist and what we think a special SME called Inquiring Minds, and of course IoTSF. I'm also pleased to tell the audience here that we've got a growing number of companies joining the specialist interest group, including some telcos such as BT and Vodafone. It's completely free to join. And so I'd just like to take the opportunity here to invite any manufacturer, ISP or telco, or any stakeholder with an interest in this space to reach out via the manysecured.net site and hopefully join this audacious and collaborative effort. So just to recap, the takeaway, IoTSF is working on a set of open technical standards and schema to enable interoperable, smart and collaborative security at scale. And we target this at the gateway. And don't forget, you're invited. Thank you.
Thanks. Great answer. So Max, maybe to you, Siemens clearly has already established itself with some interesting capabilities where you are rendering managed security services and managed detection and response capabilities for some of your clients. What do you think are some of the greatest cybersecurity risks to industrial IoT today when transforming from analog to digital operations? And what do you see as the future trends of AI in addressing these risks in the next 5 years? Max?
Yes, thank you. So when it comes to IoT, I do want to be very clear. In the energy sector, we have one planet, and IoT is definitely one of the means that allows us to optimize and allow us to gain efficiency and introduce a decarbonization and other methods in the production of energy. It's also a huge aspect in the renewable aspect of energy production. Besides that really high benefit, that also means that it is picking up at light speed and being implemented across the globe for good purposes, but it also comes with an additional vector where now we're actually introducing the linkage between digital aspects and physical aspects in the environment, and putting the two together, really creating that transformation. And of course, there are other aspects that are inducing that as well. However, specific to IoT, this exposes beyond the advantage also another concern and risk vector as well. So what is actually happening is twofold. So if you simplify that down, what's happening is now the control of IoT is providing information to adjust systems. And that can also be abused, and that is one of a method of risk as well. The key aspect is considering the industry we're in. This is being introduced into oftentimes very legacy environments, not necessarily the most mature strategies, depending on where you are. And the leverage or the visibility to make sure you understand the processes in combination with the potential threat, which is back to your point, John. I take that invite and I will follow up with you on this. But what's happening and what we have actually done, so we've combined that responsibility and that future risk exposure increase to actually look at that. And coming from Siemens Energy, we have a wealth of knowledge and experience on understanding the processes. And that is one of the gaps that is missed out, where you actually oftentimes implement tools and technology to gain visibility of the IT aspect. But the context is what is crucial to be able to act on it. And when you look at what Leo mentioned in his presentation earlier, what we call EOS.II. So EOS is the goddess of dawn, and II stands for intelligent illumination. It's actually very applicable to many states of environments today, considering the diversity and the spread and the different age of different assets and the lack of visibility, which is something that with EOS, we actually don't just enlighten it, but we actually enrich it and are able to provide the context to take that away and then respond in an effective manner. That is also, and this goes a bit back into what we call managed detection and response. So managed detection and response is a service we have, and EOS is the engine behind it. EOS is built with, we spent 2.5 years with our engineers and our people that have gone through many scenarios and actually put all that in a ML model to allow it to scale and capture all that knowledge. Then on beyond that, just having that knowledge and getting that insight doesn't necessarily mean you have the right means to respond. Keep in mind, in a lot of sites in the energy sector, the response is very complex and it's very different from, there's a lot of considerations to take, as the priorities are also always about maintaining operations and health and safety. With MDR, we actually have our security analysts, which mainly come from an OT background and have been uplifted to increase their security capability. So they actually understand the methodology and the environment and are enriched by EOS.II. And with that, we can actually provide a visibility which, from what I have understood, hasn't been done yet in specifically the energy sector, where you combine the understanding of the environment and processes, capture all the information, and provide guidance to really achieve that resilience at scale. I do have to say this is very applicable and especially enticing for smaller environments where the capability to set something up where we spent 2.5 years is a far stretch. And that's also where we have split out EOS and MDR, the service from the intelligence and what we've built and what we continue to maintain. And that's actually where we're embarking on collaborating with governments, associations, to be able to adopt that knowledge and know-how into countries that potentially really require it, or where the resilience is still at a stage where such uplift would make a huge impact.
Max, I think with what you have achieved in Siemens, that really is echoing a key theme that many of you have spoken about, which is the reducing of time to insights, thereby leading to a reduced time to action, whether we call it mean time to respond or mean time to recover. But one thing that comes resonating from this sharing of telemetry or information is privacy concerns. It's about business sensitive telemetry as well. What are some of these challenges that you face in establishing this offering? And more importantly, how have you attempted to overcome them? And I welcome any of the other speakers to actually share your viewpoints here as well. But maybe Max, for you to kick off.
Okay, sure, appreciate that. So even we deal ourselves with that complexity. We do capture a lot of rich information that actually, because of our responsibility as an OT provider, we do have to share that to a certain extent, especially with our existing customers that leverage our technology. However, I do believe, and we have MOUs with several institutions where we actually give a deeper insight and experience and methodologies that we know could really change the maturity of a customer by sharing this experience. Your question is, what's the complexity with sharing that information? I personally think there is, of course, when you share the actual details, there's a lot of privacy concerns, but the telemetry when it comes to the IOCs and the unique environments and the unique cases is something that can be shared without breaking any privacy concerns as well, as long as it is anonymized and it's scrutinized for that aspect as well.
Are there any other speakers that would like to add on additional points here? Okay, if not, maybe I'll direct to Tiang. What do you think are the greatest cybersecurity risks for medical IoT today? And more importantly, what do you think or what do you see as future trends for the application of AI in addressing these risks in the next 5 years?
Sure. I think, as I mentioned earlier, when we look at the different industries, the healthcare sector was #1 in terms of cybersecurity attacks. And I have to say that the medical devices are easier target when we look at the data. Some of the top threats, we look at a couple million devices on our platform, and we shared some of the data with the market. In general, I want to mention a few things, a few observations. One is a lot of the legacy operating systems, right? For example, we saw that 83% of the medical imaging systems have outdated operating systems. That could be quite an issue, right? Bring a lot of vulnerabilities. Second one we see is, I call it the unsegmented networks. So it's very important to have a proper segmentation to prevent threat and prevent lateral movement. If you look at some of the threats, many of them are coming from the IT, and then they move into the IoT and the medical side. We also see the IoT device, because they're vulnerable, they can become a jump host for attacker to come in and then proliferate into the rest of the IT side. So we do see people try to do segmentation, but because of a lack of visibility, most of these segmentation has not been very effective. You see this mix of devices, and then you see lateral movement out there. The third one I would say is I call it the pre-exist vulnerabilities. it's known fact that many of these IoT devices or medical devices, they ship without a lot of a strong security practice. We see that 98% of these IoT devices don't encrypt their traffic. They use legacy protocols. They got weak manufacturing username password, very easy to get in, right? So these are some of the top risks we're seeing in these medical devices. And to your second question, I think the AI/ML is going to be transformative in cybersecurity. It's going to play an increasing role over the years. We're only seeing the beginning of it, right? So in my talk, I mentioned, how do we use machine learning as a way to drive device classification, and because these machines are designed for performing specific things, it's a perfect example or candidate for machine learning type technologies. And this is the only way to scale, right? There's going to be millions and millions of new devices coming to the market, and the traditional signature-based approach is going to be challenging. And then we talk about using machine learning to understand the baseline behavior of these IoT devices. Once you understand the pattern, it's a great information for you to use that to design your security policy, and then you can use that to understand anomalies and day zero threats, right? We see increasing adoption of machine learning in the broader cybersecurity side. We're the first one who launched the machine learning powered next-gen firewall, and I see multiple use cases out there. For example, automating tasks such as log analysis, policy optimization, for example, threat detection and classification. For example, phishing, we launched the advanced URL to really detect some of these sophisticated attacks. People morph and evade your existing security solutions. So machine learning can be a great way to do that. So those are some of the use cases, web cloaking, so on and so forth, right? I think we're only at the beginning of leveraging machine learning to provide better security and to provide better automation.
Thanks. And I think with the greater adoption as we are seeing to be trending in the next few years of AI, clearly the concerns come up whether there is ethical use of AI, whether there's bias going to be built in to AI. How are those actually attempted to overcome within your approaches right now?
I think this is, I think you're touching on a very emerging topic.
Yes.
In terms of, how the malicious actors can leverage machine learning as a way to evade cybersecurity. We're seeing some of that. I think this is a strong interest in the academia as well, in terms of how do we handle that. So we're very active in the research in this area, and we're also in some of the coalition as well to contribute our insight. I think this is a very new topic in the industry, and people are looking into what's the solutions, but I don't think there's a mature answer, in my opinion. And people are still in the researching stage at this point. But within Palo Alto, we do have a lot of internal researchers here in terms of not only just how to use machine learning as a way to drive cybersecurity, but then how do we pay attention to the bad use of the technology, and then how do we deal with that?
Right. And I note in your presentation earlier, you highlighted that the nature of IoT basically forces us to put a lot more controls and monitoring at the network layer. But I'm also very mindful that there is increasing levels of compute capability built into IoT these days. There is also more storage that's also put in there. That's why we are concerned collectively if IoT devices are becoming more capable botnets, if they are compromised and so on. So do you see a day where endpoint and hardware level types of security features will actually start to appear in IoT? I know this is a bit of a curveball.
I do see that. I see folks in the panel, some of you guys are from standard body. I see a lot of a concerted movement in terms of adding security. For example, hardware key stores, secure boot, some of the meaningful effort happening in the industry. With that said, if you look at the so-called IoT devices, it's a huge spectrum, right? You got devices that barely have anything. You got medical devices, some medical devices, you have full OS and full storage. I think because of the huge spectrum, I'm of the view that for the foreseeable future, the whole market will continue to be very fragmented, and also plus the legacy nature of these IoT devices, it's going to be becoming worse because before it's becoming better. But I do see effort of putting standard into these IoT devices to make them more secure in terms of adopting, from hardware security to some of the best practice, right? In terms of encrypting the packet and don't use default username password. The basic stuff people have been doing it on the IT side for years. These things are getting into the IoT side as well.
John, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'd just like to add some to what John was talking about. Again, I think, and I'll speak a bit more about this in a moment, but when we talk about IoT and those billions of devices, I mean, this is very broad church, as John was saying. We typically think of an IoT device as maybe being a very small, tiny sensor. But let me kind of scale it up for you. I mean, I was on a session yesterday where we were talking about a car as an IoT device. And I think certainly some of the trends that have been talked about here, electrification, obviously EVs are coming through very strongly, connected and autonomous vehicles. But a car itself, you could describe that as an iPad on wheels, if you're looking at something like the Tesla. And I've heard that described for many years. But you can also look at it as a data center on wheels too. Now, you've got to have security right there at that endpoint, because it's got much more, it's much more sensitive. You don't want your braking system to have to go up to the cloud and come back down before it does anything. So you've got to make some of these controls localized. And it makes a lot of sense in terms of security as well. Indeed, there's a sister organization to IOTSF called ASIN, and it looks about automotive electronics innovation. And what they talk about is not security. They talk about digital survivability and resilience. I think I've got that right.
Yes.
And so it really brings together what you need in a vehicle. It's significantly more than security. So that's the way they term the problem. Simple cyber in terms of digital survivability and resilience.
Yeah, John, I can echo to it. I used to work with some of the automakers. In the car, it used to be CAN bus. And then you have some control unit. They are separated right now because all the car manufacturers want to get more data from the car. So guess what? There's a network running in the car, and the control and the infotainment, they're all connected. It's huge concern in terms of how you secure that environment, right? Because it could be very problematic, once the threats get into the control path and.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to John's earlier point in the presentation, which is I think IoT cannot be seen as one module by itself, but it's now becoming more system of systems, so to speak. And that collective systems, Tesla's vehicle, as an example, would be that one monolithic system of systems that we might be concerned about, because the actuation effects could lead towards, let's say, safety issues, for example. So with that, maybe let's switch gears to our second segment, and that's on the topic of international cooperation in IoT cybersecurity analytics. And to kick it off, maybe to Max, what do you think are the benefits in the stakeholders coming together to share industrial IoT cybersecurity data? What do you think are the obstacles to data sharing? And how do we actually encourage data sharing? Mindful of the earlier point that I highlighted, which is the business sensitive data, considering that many competitors would actually be using such a information sharing platform. How do you then kind of protect the interests of each organization participating in this information sharing? Max, I think you might be on mute.
Apologies, too ambitious. So to be honest, when you dive into the details, when you look at specific sectors, a lot of the IoT capability is actually built proprietary as well.
Yes.
And one of the big complexities is that the way language is used, it's actually not a commonality. And this is really going into deep OT environments. Now, there is a shift above that as well. And this is where the communication is still under development, I would say. But when you look at the impact it has, and when you look at the trends that are actually captured through the visibility of what IoT can bring from a threat vector as well, those aspects can be shared. And actually, there's a lot of lessons learned that can be shared. That community does exist. However, again, to one of John's points, we ourselves, we see it very regional and not so much global yet. And to get to the point of global, I like you said, in 5 years from now, we looked at that 5 years ago and we're still not there. The worst part is that the threat actors are actually all sharing all their information and enriching each other, which is increasing that gap. So it is of essence. How, I guess maybe John, I'd like to ask you, how do you foresee within 5 years in such a proprietary type sector where that could be achieved? Sorry to divert the question to you. I'd be curious for your opinion.
Well, I guess I think of what I'd like to talk about, this thing IoT. We've had a good discussion here across different sectors, and it was curious to me that when we're talking about the energy sector, we're talking about operational technology. Because to some degree, a large degree actually, IoT is an operational technology. It is in that realm of cyber physical. It's distinctly different from some of the cyber aspects of the past. So where we will be looking at things like information assurance, for example, where you're looking at IP and property theft, because IoT really does allow you to do attacks in a physical sense. And I think that's the scary part. The other thing I'd like to kind of just draw out from why it's a bit different, if you like, a bit different to OT, is that if you look at those traditional OT environments, they were proprietary. They tend to be, in terms of what we've talked about, cars, inside factories, for example, SCADA equipment, ICS, and those types of things. But the point about IoT is suddenly it's on a common network. It's out there in the world, and that's the difference. And in fact, I would take that distinction between OT and M2M as well, because those typically tend to be proprietary systems. But with IoT, it's out there. The attack surface is expanding massively, because that is the point. The point is these are zero trust environments, which we haven't had to deal with in the past. They've typically been air-gapped. They've been maybe manufacturers that would make proprietary systems that could define their own protocols and their interfaces. And then suddenly they're being connected up to other systems, which suddenly makes the attack surface massively. So, and I'll probably make reference to this again, it is the IoT invasion. Whether we like it or not, it's coming, and it's coming at us from all quarters. And that makes it very difficult. And what I would also say is, our opening keynote talked about the winter is coming and we're in the depth of winter. I actually kind of feel a bit more, looking at this problem for the last 5 or 6 years now, I feel a bit more optimistic about it. I accept that all these bad things are happening, but guess what? Cybersecurity is mainstream now. It's not the preserve of just some specialists and experts. When I go out and I talk about what I do, I never have a problem talking about cybersecurity, because somebody's always, they recognize the problem. So as I like to think, if we take that kind of maturity model, it's market terms, the experts were really kind of the early adopters in some regard. I would see myself as one of the early majority, but I think we really are moving into the mainstream. So I think I'm much more optimistic. Yes, we've got lots of problems. Yes, we've got to address them. We need lots of mitigations in lots of different areas, but it's a recognized problem. And the more light we can shine on the problem, the better we are at solving those issues. So key to trust, of course, is transparency. Obviously, we do need to share. When something bad happens, I would like to think that as soon as anything bad happens anywhere, everybody knows about it and we can fix things rather quickly, because this is one of the tools of the criminals, of course, and the nefarious. They kind of rely to some degree on us being embarrassed to say that we've been compromised. But guess what? In this digital age, data breaches are a fact of life. Get over it, fix it. That's the point. Resilience is the thing now. Let's not be so secretive. So I would like to think that, again, as I talk about this progression, let's not be embarrassed by it. Let's understand that and all share. And so, for example, one of the things I did like about the GDPR is the note that if you are breached, you have to give notice. I think that's a good thing, and we should be less embarrassed about it, because in this new digital realm, this new digital age, to some degree, we're all naked. And so let's get over it, but I do accept the point too. There will be, especially there's a lot of sensitive information, so we've got to come up with ways of protecting those sensitivities, but sharing, maybe anonymizing, find good ways of anonymizing, or maybe parceling it up where nothing sensitive is shared, but the important parts can be acted upon.
Thanks. And I think the echoing points that are coming out is taking deliberate action in terms of anonymizing the data, selecting appropriate but actionable pieces of telemetry that can be then shared across the ecosystem, so that there's collective benefit or collective immunity, as I like to believe, or collective awareness. Maybe switching gears to Qiang, what do you think are the benefits for the stakeholders coming together, in particular with your exposure on medical IoT? When we look at their cybersecurity data, what do you think are the obstacles towards this data sharing, and how do we actually encourage this data sharing?
Okay, interesting question. I think in general, we all know that for AI, for machine learning, you need a lot of data in terms of quality and quantity, right? And then, but sometimes it can be hard to get the data. In general, people do want to share it, but I don't think the industry is mature enough. A lot of things hasn't been figured out, right? There's, I think, John mentioned the data privacy concern. I also think from the manufacturing point of view, there's a lot of concern about losing trade secret, losing the competitiveness when they share data. And also there's no good platform to share data so that the data doesn't fall into the bad hands, right? I've seen some industry, my personal view is that when the benefit is overcome the trade-off, people will start to do it. In some industry, for example, in the some of the machine builders in Europe, like they formed this platform called Atmos. You might have heard it. The vision is kind of a share data and build common applications, right? So I'm seeing some movement here and there, but by and large, I think it's at the very early stage. The approach we're taking is that we do want to contribute to the community. We can share, what we are doing is sharing some of the insights we're getting from the machine learning. This could be threat research. We do publish threat research for IoT in terms of what do we see out there in terms of the device landscape, what are the top threats, so that we can help to raise awareness. In our product, we do share some of the, we call it the metadata, for example, the baseline of your machine, right? I talk about, your infusion pump, how does it behave differently from all the other infusion pump we see across the world? That's a great benefit to many customers, right? Because they can use that as a way to define their policy. We also share a bit about, we call it industry trend, right? How does your risk score comparing to the rest of the peers in the same region and across the globe, right? These are the things that we can share without breaking a lot of the privacy. One interesting thing in the healthcare space we're trying to push is the so-called MDS2 document. It stands for Manufacturing Disclosure Statement of Medical Device Security. So it's a mouthful, that's why it's called MDS squared, right? So essentially you can see this as a security data sheet for a medical equipment. The vendor do publish that. So we're trying to build a community where all the customer can upload the MDS2 document, because there are millions of these medical devices, right? If you look at the MDS2 document, we parse about 50 plus attribute for security behavior. For example, can these medical systems be upgraded remotely, right? If the OEM says no, and then our machine learning sees internet file transfer, then something goes wrong. So these are meaningful sharing across the community that in a fairly confined baby step way for people to share and then benefit from it. I think those are the things we're trying before we can take the big step over time.
I think that's interesting because logically all of us are thinking if we are sharing information as it is across, then clearly it's a very dangerous space for us to be with, because then we would have access to every single other party that is connected into this information sharing platform. But if we are now at that nascent step of discovering what are fundamental pieces of telemetry, telemetry that is not attributable, so to speak, whether we choose anonymization, we choose deliberate selection of criteria or attributes, and sharing that, maybe that's already collectively helpful. And I think one topic that you also highlighted is maybe in a not such a direct fashion, but how do we actually make cybersecurity easy? As it is with many of the great devices that we hold every day, the user experience make it so easy for us to gain access to information, to do what we need to do. And maybe we are at that inflection point in cybersecurity, particularly in the areas of IoT, where we are now developing better user experiences and helping to make cybersecurity a little bit more easily accessible. So that's maybe food for thought for many of us. Maybe for the next question, I'll point towards Atsushi. What can we do to encourage or promote cooperation in IoT cybersecurity analytics between governments and private sector?
Thank you for your question. And in our project to identify vulnerable IoT devices and providing alerts, which is called Notice and Nectar Alert. And both National Institute called NICT and private ISPs go hand in hand together to identify vulnerable IoT devices and provide alert to the users. And in order to realize this framework, our government has amended some acts or amended some rules and encouraged private sectors to participate in these projects. And as shown in this example, I believe that the role of the government to establish some framework to encourage cooperation between public and private sectors is quite important. And in addition, it may be desirable for governments to take a lead to establish information sharing organizations such as ISAC among private entities and encourage their information sharing. And in case of incidents, some reporting system from private sectors to the government might also be needed. And there would be some cases where the government may provide some cybersecurity information to private sectors. And with regards to, I think it can also be argued with regards to government cooperation. And it could be an idea for governments to share some information acquired through their network observation activities with other countries. And in this respect, we have an alerting system called Daedalus in our Nectar observation system. And so we are currently promoting foreign governments to be a receiver of the alert so that both governments can share the information that implies possible risks or vulnerabilities. And in any case, such international cooperation is very important to address IoT cybersecurity issues, even in the cooperation between private sector levels. Thank you.
Thanks. And I think it's very helpful for you to share with us that perspective coming from the Japan story, so to speak, about how you are actually encouraging within your ecosystem the collaboration between ISPs, the consumers, the businesses that are affected, and how do you actually work with your regulations to actually encourage that participation. And what is also noteworthy for me is your project Daedalus that actually helps potentially encourage government-to-government data exchange for that collective benefit of cyber defense. Now, maybe towards John, there are already billions of online IoT devices, we've established that. But so how can the ecosystem actually work together to start sharing these kind of threats that are targeting whether specific or collective devices?
So again, I'd like to, I guess, pick up on some of the themes, but refer back to the ManySecure project that I talked about earlier, because I think what we really need to do is break it down. And I'm going to identify three, well, I think of three key areas, again, which we're working on inside that project, whilst we're thinking about those billions of devices. So number one, we're looking at the practicality of creating a common language. And again, I think, Chung, you kind of alluded to this in some of what you were talking about, but could we get a common language for device types, which really helps us understand and manage those types? The second thing involves understanding and managing those device behaviors once we have the language of devices. And thirdly, can we improve how we manage device vulnerabilities, including things like software updates? So first and foremost, device types. If you look at the sheer number of devices, as we've already said, it's too big and too varied to think about all of them as just one kind of amorphous monolith. We've got to break them down so we can focus and pinpoint on how we can collaborate. So that's why we believe we need a common language of devices. So within the ManySecure project, we're looking at what we're labeling. Sorry for the pause there, I was just trying to read my own notes. What we're labeling distributed device descriptors, or what we call D3. We were thinking about calling it 3D, but we felt the graphics market has got that cornered. So D3. So D3 is a language of types where we can declare specific device information, such as manufacturer, the product model, the manufacture date, firmware version, and so forth. And of course, some of you may be aware of some of the work that's been going on at the IETFF and its MUD initiative. MUD, we think, is a really good initiative, but I think, speaking to the experts in the group, it's got its limitations, and we think there's some practical issues with it. So we would like to build on the work of MUD. So within those device types, we can also understand relationships. I think this is an important part, actually. We can understand the relationships and the hierarchy with other devices. So, for example, you may have a webcam which shares common elements with other products, such as firmware. And we can also then ask what we expect from those device types. How should they behave? Who should they be talking to, and how often? And if we know this, we can make it easier to spot and something suspicious when that's happening. And again, Chung, I kind of recognize some of the things that you were talking about in that space too. So that was very interesting. So secondly, then, we can look at behavior monitoring. We know there's a lot of good open source tools and some really good companies offering black boxes to monitor when bad things are happening. But we've got a bigger ambition. Our ambition really is to lower the barriers to threat monitoring with interoperable methods or schemas. And I think it's also worth noting at this point that when we start introducing such schema, they could be used against us. So we need to think very carefully about how effective they can be, consider what we might inadvertently expose or disclose in such schema, and also things like access rights and who we give them to. Now, we acknowledge fully that these are tricky problems to solve. They're essential problems to solve, but we believe that we need to solve them to meet that challenge. And finally, I talked a little bit about device vulnerabilities and the ability to collaborate on things like the description, the submission, and the mitigation of vulnerabilities more generally. think it's fair to say that certainly in the IT space, vulnerability disclosure is well understood. What we've actually found at IoT SF is that in the IoT space, it's not so well understood. And we've spent a lot of our time in the past couple of years really trying to help raise awareness of the issues and provide training materials. So we've got a lot of good practices and videos and talks on our website. But again, we ask, are we really just scratching the surface of what's possible by these, what we would consider to be fairly manual processes? So how can we simplify the process, make it quicker, and how can we automate it and make it applicable at scale? So one of the challenges that we see with current vulnerability disclosure process is that when a disclosure is made, the description of the device is typically described in free-form text. So we try to imagine how much better this would be if we could be more precise, identify the device type and be less ambiguous and more specific. And if we can use the language of device types, again, D3 that I've already mentioned, as part of the vulnerability disclosure process, we could make our vulnerability and threat sharing much more refined, make it much more accessible to automated systems and algorithms. So I think I'll just park it there, leaving a taster of how I think we could do this from a technical point of view. So there were three things I've talked about, which is collaboration on the description of IoT device types, collaboration on the methods of sharing IoT networking activity, and collaborate on the formal description of vulnerabilities. And I think it's only fair to say that there's a lot of good in-depth work going on there within the Managed Security Initiative. And I just hope that I've done my colleagues justice on representing it here today. Again, I would like to invite anybody who's interested in this area to join the specialist interest group. It's free to join. There's no cost to it. And we'd certainly like to have you along to help us get a much better view of some of the challenges and how we apply some solutions. So thanks.
And I think we have just over a minute left. I'd like to do a bit of a rounding up for what we have discussed in this session. I take away two key points. We are really driving after collaboration, where we're looking at the concepts of public-private partnerships as highlighted by Leo. There is an element of consumer education that we're also encouraging. There is the other topics, which is about establishing cybersecurity standards and making them free, as highlighted by John. And John, I think you also highlighted a few other key areas, such as going global, both considering the global aspects of it, the local aspects of it, and building systemic resilience across the use of IoT when it comes to cybersecurity. I think we touched on some of the slivers of economic drivers, encouraging that there needs to be economic drivers to drive significant progress in this area. And much of that relies on getting the significant purchases of devices to actually mandate or require that cybersecurity is baked in at the onset. When we look towards collective situation awareness, we see the Japan story shared by Atsushi when we look at the Notice and Nectar projects. And as highlighted by Qiang, there is that initial fundamental aspects of need for us to perform inventory of assets first, before we go towards the likes of classification of the device nature, the risks and the threats. And all these are then culminating together back to the topic, which is the nexus of AI and IoT cyber analytics. And I know, John, you've been advocating it over and over again, the participation in all these community projects that are now going on. And I'd like to just end off by saying thank you to all our panelist speakers. It's been a very illuminating conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to our moderator and our panelists for that very insightful panel discussion. But before we end off, let us come together once again for a big group photograph. So, Mr. Teo and panelists, do kindly look into your cameras. Definitely a new type of a virtual group photograph over there. And with that, once again, a very big thank you to our speakers today. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of the International IoT Security Roundtable Technical Panel. Please do view the SICW program under the calendar of events to find out more about the upcoming programs lined up for you. Thank you and goodbye.